If you followed along with some of these videos, you understand that what we're about, we white viewers or those educated by traditional public schools, that what we're about is getting our heads into different frameworks for understanding our own history. And this requires first a recognition that it is a story of encounter which drives the history Black Hawk has written. That so far, everything we've discussed are the various dynamics of how native populations interacted with explorers, settlers, and colonists. And if you've been more or less okay with this up to now, excellent. But this may be in part because the history we've discussed so far, right up to the American Revolution, is more or less dim in our thinking anyway. Outside of some Pilgrim and Thanksgiving stories, maybe some odd witch trials, we don't imagine much of our European-sided story of the building colonies, more's the pity. Now though, today, we have to push hard against some of our thinking that has entrenched itself into the founding of the United States. And this is because of a lot of the same issues we've already touched upon. I talked early on about how we must make an epistemological shift, that how we know what we know must be challenged. More, we discussed the various interpretative tools which might be valuable to us. For instance, so many of our casual terms for this period, frontier, undiscovered land, westward expansion, things like that, work to erase the real and complex history of indigenous rituals and politics, the inland sea of encounter, wampum as a tool for diplomacy and levered later as economic power. Once we start thinking this way, we start to understand that our American history exists in a lot of places besides just the east coast of Boston, Philadelphia, and the like. To think of our revolutionary history as operating merely on the East Coast, like our history books do, is exactly the act of indigenous absence, or more precisely, indigenous erasure we've discussed. And so for this reason, I'm going to say that this chapter in Black Hawk pushes hard against our remaining barriers to understanding. We spent a fair amount of time talking about the native inland sea, the waterways which course through Michigan down through Ohio and Mississippi valleys, and all the people in commerce and relationships that are operating there, a place of active mediation. It seems almost intentionally obtuse to turn away from it now, doesn't it? But the British were supposedly in charge now, and the French had lost the French and Indian War, a decade of two empires deciding who would control it all. Now the British were in charge, and they declared, with the proclamation of 1763, the absolute border between British and indigenous lands. And even though settlers were eager to discover, or maybe simply seize, all the land available to them, the Crown forbade it. After all, the war had been costly, and England could not afford to deploy more armies to the interior to protect anyone. Instead, they began to strike deals with the various tribes to assuage such conflicts. The dividing line was as much a choice of budget as it was of politics. But in doing so, the Crown sparked a profound imperial crisis. By drawing a legal border to protect native land, George III, yeah, that George, angered his own expansionist colonists. French and Spanish traders were already working tightly with the indigenous confederacies. The Métis people operated as middlemen across the cultures, and perhaps most important, a number of British land speculators and traders were already there, conducting healthy and expensive speculative business, surveying, doing some under-the-table deals, telling the tribes that the proclamation wasn't really enforceable. Among them was a young George Washington and the companies he partnered with, worth remembering for later. So, with all this going on, it's hard to tell more settlers that they can't cross that Appalachian line and get what they could. And from what we've already described here, this isn't some kind of absolute border between the civilized and the wild anyway. We know by now, it's just people meeting and making choices everywhere. In other words, a full 10 years before any tea parties in Boston, the sparks of revolution were already igniting. Now, if you're thinking that the tribes were themselves in some disorder at the time, that would be right, and maybe not so much. Yes, we still had the migration or refugee crises that we've discussed from the East, but also let's remember that the indigenous communities had learned the survival tactics of ethnogenesis and forming coalescent societies. In other words, nothing was singularly true from one year to the next as people met and traded and restructured and consolidated. In fact, this was the exact moment when tribal leaders like the prophet Neolin and Chief Pontiac rose in response to British rule, organizing vast networks of native peoples to seize British forts. If anything, this was a time of cultural revitalization for the indigenous peoples here. Neolin, otherwise known as the Delaware Prophet, described the future as bountiful, a place separate, apart from all the Europeans. And so, too reminiscent of the race thinking that political philosophers like Hannah Arendt track in Europe at the same time, a new ideology emerged: Indian hating. Now, I want to be careful as we understand this. By and large, prior to this time, whites in America distinguished between the allied and enemy tribes. Those who perhaps became Christian and lived peacefully alongside and even within the white communities, those who made treaties and defended white settlers and soldiers in times of war, and those who did not. But two, with these illegal scrambles for land and power, settlers German, Scots-Irish, English, etc., all found themselves divided and arguing for who deserved what. We see now a political means of unifying the settler movement move forward in some alliance, targeting all the Indians as racial enemy, justifying dispossession and extermination. And they do it, of course, regardless of any treaties that King George across the Atlantic was putting together to repair its treasury. Us? We're not royalty. We're not those rich traders from Philadelphia and New York. We're just common folk, woodsmen and family men, and what, now the crown is going to tell us we can't have anything when it's right there in front of us? This was what Black Hawk described as the beginnings of settler uprisings. And this is not a small part of our colonial or revolutionary history, just one that is too rarely taught. The Paxton Boys promote Indian hating as political motivation openly. But also, there's the lesser known but even more violent Black Boys, Wyoming Valley Vigilantes, Augusta County Militia, and others. All of them were violent, mob-driven vigilante groups who used mass violence on all indigenous peoples, even the Christianized who lived amongst them. And critically, they did it in open defiance to the British Crown and could not be stopped with the tools that the Empire had available. Do you see the revolution forming way out here in this native inland sea? It did. Its level of interdiction and death made moments like a Tea Party or even the casualties at Lexington pale. And it's a force that would not limit its resistance to England, but to the later new American government. What we begin to see in this moment is an emergent settler sovereignty. By this, I mean a new kind of political policy, a belief that no central authority will ever dictate the aspirations for land and liberty. And whether or not it's always practiced violence to demonstrate its strength, that potential for bloodshed underscored it. It would resist the British, destroy the diplomacy so long practiced by the indigenous nations, and it would remove them, erase them from what was rightfully theirs. The concept was so profound and unwieldy that our white founding fathers, including the inland sea land speculators, had to write it directly into our own founding documents. To understand, we're talking about George Washington, as I said, but also Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and a guy named Robert Morris, a merchant prince who was essentially the billionaire equivalent of his day. A man so wealthy, he financed the American Revolution out of his own pocket. Like I said, yes, This demands we think a bit differently about our revolution, which we learned was all about those cities in the East. And, well, that's where the rich lived anyway.